Okay, so I thought it could be useful to do a refresher on the objects of negation of the philosophical schools, which if you've done tenets or you've studied a bit of the philosophical schools, sometimes maybe it could be useful. I don't know. Okay, so what are the philosophical schools doing? What are they trying to get at? So all the Buddhist schools agree that we suffer because of misperceptions, misconceptions of reality. We distort reality. And so what all the philosophical schools are trying to do is first get at the nature of the mistake, either the mistake that's keeping us in samsara or the mistake that's preventing us achieving enlightenment. So they're trying to get at what the mistake is, the distortion, the ignorance that is keeping us stuck. And then at the same time, positing the wisdom such that when we are free of that mistake, we are free from the cause keeping us in samsara, or we become free from the obstruction stopping us from attaining enlightenment. And the four schools are trying to do that. They're trying to get at the size and the nature of the mistake without falling into one of the two extremes. Either the extreme of eternalism, meaning we are positing an object of negation, an object of refutation that's big and heavy and grows too much. Because if you over exaggerate the size of the mistake, then negating that isn't going to have much of an effect on the root misperception. You're negating something much bigger, and you can negate that, but it's not going to get at the heart. They're also trying to avoid the extreme of nihilism, of negating that which does exist, even conventionally. So they're trying to avoid the mistake of negating what does exist. And they're all trying to find the size of the mistake between those two extremes. Okay, so let's start with the first two schools. Both the Vaibhashika and the Sautantrika schools agree that the root misperception at the root of our suffering that's keeping us in samsara, the first link of dependent arising, if you're familiar with that, the first misperception is a conception holding to a self that is self-sufficient, substantially existent. What does that mean? Okay, so the let's start with the self-sufficient component. The teachings that I've heard on this are that self-sufficient means that we are holding to a self that's within our mind-body collection, within our psychophysical aggregates, yet it sticks out a bit. It's kind of the boss. It's like having a factory with lots of factory workers, and there's one factory foreman who's slightly in charge, slightly the boss. That's one way it's described. Or another way I've heard it described is we can get the measure of it when we see ourselves saying, my body, my mind, as if there's an I in here, and yet it's kind of the boss. It's the possessor of the body and the mind. Then there's substantially existent. So what does substantially existent mean? Anything that is substantially existent, we can get at pretty easily, in order for pen to dawn to my mind, I just need to see a pen. In order for hat to dawn to my mind, I just need to see a hat, right? It's pretty simple. But if something is not that, if it is not substantially existent, then something else needs to appear to my mind before I can get at the thing. Okay, let's use an example. Culture. So if I say Spanish culture or French culture, Irish culture, Italian culture, what dawns to the mind? It could be food, it could be drink, but something else has to appear to us first before we can get an idea of culture. because culture isn't substantially existent. Something else has to dawn to the mind first. And so it said that in the same way, the self, either ourselves or somebody else's personhood, can only appear to us depending on something else. Now, in the case of the somebody else, let's say it's usually their form aggregate. So before we can recognize who's coming towards us, we see their body. So in dependence upon the body, we say, oh, that's so and so, right? So thinking that the person doesn't exist in that way, that they don't require anything else to dawn to the mind in order for it to appear, is saying that they are substantially existent. Like table, cup, chair. Okay. So that's a mistake, thinking that the person is substantially existent, that you don't need either the aggregate of consciousness or form or anything else for it to appear to the mind. That's one mistake. And then the other mistake is the self-sufficient component. Okay. And that self-sufficient, substantially existent self is posited as a misconception, a distortion, a mistaken way, a wrong concept, such that if you remove that by having the wisdom realizing the non-existence of existing in that way, then you can free yourself from samsara and achieve personal liberation. So if I have my backpack of wrong concepts, okay, and the Vaibhashikas and the Sautrantikas will take out of the backpack the conception of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And only that. They say there is no problem with objects, there's no problem with phenomena. Phenomena are truly established external objects, they exist as they appear. All of the things I'm looking at out of the window, the trees, the sky, everything else exists as it appears. There is no mistake there, so we don't need to worry about it. The Chittamatrans say that's not entirely true. They will agree that grasping at the concept of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self is a root of samsara. And if you want to achieve personal liberation, you remove that. They will agree with that. They will agree. They will say, however, we also want to attain enlightenment. And there are more obstacles to get out of the way if we want to achieve that. And they have two things that they say need to get out of the way. So in our backpack of wrong concepts, the Chittamatrans say, you need to take out another one. So the first wrong concept that the Chittamat, I should have said earlier, that as you move up to the philosophical schools, each one negates something that the earlier one asserts. So here the Chittamatrans are really looking at the Sautrantikas and taking issue with them a little bit. And they say, there is something you assert that we don't, and we're taking out of the backpack. We refute it. The first thing they refute is the concept of phenomena being a natural basis for the names given to them. So they say if phenomena existed in that way, for example, anyone who sees water will call it water. They won't call it, for example, pani, which is used in Nepal, maybe India as well, I'm not sure, acqua in Italian. If something is the natural basis for a name, everyone will call it that naturally. And they say things don't exist like that. So they exclude phenomena existing. That's their conception. They exclude phenomena existing as a natural basis for names. And we might think, well, who asserts that? But who says that things are like that? We all understand that there are different languages and we have different names for things. But we've got to check and see if we don't act as if things existed that way, as if, especially other people, for example, we give them names and labels and adjectives and judgments, and we act as if the person was a natural basis for enemy, for example, right? So, yeah, good to check and see if we've ever acted as if things or people were natural basis for the names and descriptors we give them. Chittamatrans are saying no. The next mistake, the next wrong conception that the Chittamatrans are taking out of the bag, of our bag of wrong concepts, okay, hindering us. The next mistake that they take out is the concept of truly existent, truly established external objects out there, existing as they appear, nothing to do with us, nothing to do with our mind. They just exist nakedly, externally, like that, as they appear. That's another mistake. The Chittamatrans will say the size of the mistake is thinking that, for example, the color blue, I've got slightly cloudy, but still visible blue, so the blue sky. They say the mistake is thinking that my eye consciousness apprehending that blue and the blue appearing to it are different substances. They say things don't exist in that way at all. That in fact, the object that's dawning to me and my eye consciousness apprehending it are two results of the same karma ripening. So our karma ripen, let's say, for example, my eye is seeing something, right? So our tantrikas say, oh, it exists externally out there as it appears. The Chittamatrans will say, no, your karma is ripening. And one part of the ripening of that karma is your eye consciousness apprehending. And the other part is the way it's appearing to you. Thinking that the object in the way it's appearing to you and your eye consciousness or ear, whatever it may be, thinking those are different substances is a mistake. And that's why they are called mind only. Because they say that when you are, let's say your eye consciousness is apprehending an object, the object is in the nature of the mind. And thinking that it's otherwise, that's the mistake. And this is the first school that tells us things don't exist, phenomena other than the self, phenomena don't exist the way that they appear, that we are intimately involved in producing and projecting phenomena appear in the way that they appear back to us. And to think that they exist externally out there in some other way, that's the mistake. So 2 mistakes out of the bag for the Chittamatrans. Then we come to the Svatantrika school. So the Svatantrika say, so the Chittamatrans have refuted externally established objects. They refute that objects exist as a different substance from the mind apprehending them. The Svatantrika say, notwithstanding that, which is already a great job. I mean, the Svatantrika say not only that, there's still something more that the Chittamatrans hold on to that Svatantrikas refute. They say your object is still too heavy. You're still asserting a mode of existence that's too gross. So the Madhyamika Svatantrikas say that Madhyamika Svatantrikas refute true existence. What's true existence? True existence is existing by way of its own uncommon, something existing by way of its own uncommon characteristics without, square brackets, without also being posited through the force of appearing to a non-defective awareness. In essence, what they mean is for the mere establishment of an object, there are 2 elements to it. Number 1, it exists by way of its own characteristics, and because of being posited by an awareness. 2, okay? Exists by way of its own characteristics, yes, and by being posited by an awareness. The Chittamatra school say that not every, backpedal. For the Chittamatra school, any phenomenon has 3 natures. One of the natures involves being posited by a mind, the imputational nature. But there are two other natures, other powered nature and thoroughly established nature. Those two, for their mere establishment, their mere existence, do not require being posited by an awareness. They just exist by way of their own characteristics without being posited by the awareness. Okay? And the Svatantrikas say that's a step too far. The Svatantrikas say, thinking that it's correct to say they exist by way of their own characteristics, but if you say they exist by way of their own characteristics without being posited by a force of an awareness, you've gone too far. We reject that. So out of the bag is true existence. We've got one more mistake left in our bag of wrong concepts, and that's inherent existence. Okay. So up to this point, let's really recap. The Vaibhashikas and the Sautantrikas who want to achieve personal liberation have negated a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Then we went to the Chittamartrins. The Chittamartrins agree that if you want to achieve liberation, you have to negate self-sufficient, substantially existent self. But if you want to achieve enlightenment, you've got two more mistakes to remove. The things being a natural basis of names, and thinking there are truly established external objects, thinking that there are objects that are a different substance from the mind apprehending them. This Madhyamaka Svatantrikas also, like the Chittamartrins and the Sautantrikas, also agree that to get out of samsara, you are negating the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. True existence is what you negate to achieve enlightenment. Okay, now we get to the Prasangika Madhyamikas. So both Madhyamaka schools agree that phenomena exist depending on name and designation on a valid base. The Svatantrika will say, and it exists by way of its own characteristics. There's a meeting of two. The Svatantrikas say a phenomenon exists by way of its own characteristics and designated by name and conceptuality. Existing by way of its own characteristics, existing inherently, that's taken for granted by the Svatantrika. And then the Prasangika come along and say that thing that you take for granted as necessarily existing is our object of refutation. And so the Prasangikas, they negate inherent existence. They negate anything existing by way of its own characteristic inherently, intrinsically. They say all phenomena exist merely designated by name and conceptuality on a valid basis, not on anything, on a valid basis. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, any atom more than that, anything more than existing, dependent upon name and conceptuality, designated on a valid basis that performs a function, anything more than that is their object of negation. Okay, so we've gone up, let's go back down. Okay, so Prasangikas say phenomena exist conventionally dependent upon name and conceptuality designated on a basis of designation, not inherently. So they've removed inherent existence. Phenomena exist dependent upon name and conceptuality on a valid basis, but not inherently. The Svatantrikas say we disagree. You're nihilistic. If phenomena don't have their own essence, if they don't exist by way of their own characteristic, how is there anything that makes them uniquely that at all? So they say, no, you've gone too far. You're too nihilistic. And they put inherent existence back in the bag. And then the Chittamartrins look at the Madhyamaka Svatantrikas and say, well, you've gone too far. You're saying that all phenomena, for their mere existence, have to exist not just by way of their own characteristics, but also posited through the force of appearing to a non-defective awareness. That's too much. Phenomena have a level of weight, of substance, of solidity that is more than you are positing. You are nihilistic. And so they put true existence back in the bag. And then the Sautrantikas say, well, you Chittamatra have got it all wrong, thinking that phenomena are in the nature of the mind, that they are not externally established. What nonsense! Phenomena are externally established. And so we're putting that back into the bag. Not only that, they are natural basis for names, and so we're putting that back in the bag as well. Then the only thing that they leave out is the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. All right. So the one that I've not touched on in all of this, which you may have heard of, is the permanent unitary independent self. The reason I haven't touched on that is none of the schools posit that either as a mistake keeping us in samsara, nor as a mistake obstructing us for attaining enlightenment. It's a mode of existence asserted by non-Buddhist schools that yeah, they would refute, but they're not saying, oh, this is a big mistake, a root mistake keeping us in samsara. But we can touch on it for a moment. So some non-Buddhist schools assert, allegedly, that there is a self. Well, no, I suppose I've heard explanations like this. So yeah, it's true. There are philosophies, schools, ways of thinking that assert a self that is somehow untainted by the aggregates. Um, it's it's whatever happens to the aggregates doesn't touch this self. So then whatever you do to the aggregates will neither benefit nor harm the self. If a self existed in that way, it would, from the Buddhist point of view, be considered other than the aggregates. And that is not something that Buddhist philosophical schools assert. Because if it existed in that way, you could sort of take it out and put it on the shelf. It would be other than the aggregates, distinct from the aggregates, separate from them. And indeed, it's true. Some philosophies do assert that there is a self that that's sort of pure and untainted by the messiness of the psychophysical aggregates. That is refuted, but it's not posited as a mistake that's keeping us stuck in samsara or preventing us from attaining enlightenment.